All right, good morning again, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Eda Joa. I'm the Programs Manager at Seville Institute. And so welcome to everyone who's managed to join us to this morning's webinar on electoral capture in Southern Africa, looking at the origins, dimensions, and trajectories around this concept of electoral capture. Today's discussions and the thoughts that are going to be shared by the panelists today are based on a 3-country study that's been led by Professor Adebayo Olukoshi in partnership with Seville Institute and OSISA. So before we get underway and have a few welcoming remarks from the Executive Director of Seville Institute as well as the Executive Director of OSISA, just a few housekeeping issues. As the program director, I'm going to try and keep us to time and ensure that we conclude this webinar within the 2 hours that have been allocated. Just ask that we keep our microphones on mute throughout the discussion and throughout the presentation. But at any point, if you have any comments or questions as someone is presenting, please make use of the chat function throughout the duration of the event. We will have space in the program for an open plenary of discussions where we will allow participants to unmute themselves and provide any comments or ask any questions to the panelists. So before we delve into the meat of today's discussions, I'm going to invite firstly the Executive Director of Seville Institute, Tendai Marisa, to just say a few words in terms of around this project and to also welcome you all to the event. So over to you now, Tendai.
Good morning, colleagues, friends, and also fellow travelers on the continent. I think it was Hannibal who used to say after the end of every A-Team episode, I love it when the plan comes together. I think this for us is a culmination of hard work, at times infuriating delays. I think I speak on behalf of Eda and Ikumile, who were dealing with sort of the nitty-gritties of this project. But I think it was worth it because the issues that we are going to be discussing today, and I'm excited that I'm literally going to be a fly on the wall. I'll be listening in. We've got a panel of experts that will come and take us through the journey of the issues that are at hand. And for us, it's like putting the feast together. We're excited that we've put together this whole feast and we can have this exchange of ideas. And for those who don't know about Seville Institute, we deal with many questions of democracy and development. And in this instance, one of the questions that we're asking is, how do we address the ineffective political systems that are in place across Africa? For all of us from different countries across Africa, if there's any area of disappointment is our political systems, that they are not working as effectively as they should. Our democracies are not at the stages where we want them to be. They are not yet delivering on the goals of even those who went through the liberation struggles, etc., hoping for a better Africa or better countries. Now we're actually finding ourselves with others even questioning the idea of liberation itself. Others beginning to say that maybe we're better off under colonial rule. It's just demonstrating sort of the disappointment we have with the post-colonial order. So, and one of the challenges that we have had over the years is the ways, I think there was the euphoria in the 1990s around movement, either from military dictatorships or one-party states, especially for us here in Southern Africa, towards multi-party democracies. But I think that excitement was short-lived because we began to see the entrenchment of, even when we had sort of moved towards multi-partyism, we still have de facto one-party states. And this speaks across most of our countries here in Southern Africa, most of those that have gone through the liberation struggle. So we have the phenomena of liberation movements that have not moved from power, that have not shifted from power. It's not only in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in Tanzania, in Namibia, in Angola, and in South Africa. Liberation movements are still intact. They may have changed in terms of the face of the leadership. And the challenges that we have with the emergence of the post-1990 opposition parties. There have been contestations around how elections are managed. I think this is now a new site of struggle around the management of these elections. And this is the discussion that we're having today to say, perhaps if we fix this, we can also maybe contribute towards resolving some of the questions that we have seen in Africa. And I'll just list them. The uneven playing field for political actors, especially those in the opposition, the contestations around results of elections. This has become the norm across Africa, that after every election, we have this contestation in terms of the results, how the elections were managed, and creating a process of delegitimizing process, and to an extent that we're moving from one election to the next without even breathing or even considering other issues to do with nation building. So we're just moving from one season of electioneering into the next. So hopefully, our hope in this project, as we're working with Professor Adebayo and the researchers, was to say that maybe if the issues to do with electoral capture are addressed, we can possibly begin to address, maybe reduce this seeming high tension or contestation around elections, and maybe also in the process, breathe in again the discussion that we call the discussions around the national question, whereby we can begin to discuss development, etc. Because at the moment, we don't even have that space for in every season. I'm speaking to you from Harare, Zimbabwe. I don't think we've moved from the 2018 elections, even though we're moving into the 2023 elections. We still remain seized with either contesting the previous election or challenging if there's even ground for the next election. And the discourse or the discussion on issues to do with development, well-being, and other issues become secondary to that contestation. So at the end of the day, we do not move as a nation. And we're not the only ones. Many countries are going through this. So our hope in this is we are contributing, and we're so grateful that OSISA allowed us to play this part, OSISA, and also partnering with Professor Adebayo, to play this part in terms of saying maybe we will contribute to a new narrative to say, how do we fix this so that we can move forward? Because it's evident to us that if the issues to do with the management of elections are not resolved, we're not going anywhere as a continent or as countries. And these are issues that are in need of urgent fixing. So I'm so excited about this conversation, and I'm excited by the names I'm seeing in this sort of in the Zoom room today. And hopefully we'll have that kind of discussion that takes us forward, that does not only spotlight the problem, but also spotlight possible pathways out of the conundrum that we find ourselves in. So welcome, colleagues, and we are happy that you are here, and we are looking forward to a very interesting 2 hours ahead of us. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Tendai, for your opening statements and just for laying the platform for today's discussions. I'm now going to hand over to Siposami Malunga, who's the Executive Director of OSISA. As highlighted by Tendai, OSISA provided the necessary support for us to partner with Prof. Olukoshi and the researchers to undertake this work. So now for your opening remarks or statements for today.
Sorry, I think I was muted there. Can you hear me? I hope you can. Thank you so much, Eda, and thank you, my brother, and of course, my brother Adebayo, James, and Tinju for making the time to be here, and thank you all for joining us. OSISA is known for many things, but most known for one thing, by authoritarian regimes, which is regime change. We are obviously heavily invested in supporting democratic alternation of power, because we believe that it is the only way in which people can be placed at the center of controlling their own lives, if they are able to choose freely and fairly their own leaders. Tendai has already talked about the trajectory from post-African independence, through coups and all the way to the introduction of multi-party democracy and electoral democracy. One thing for certain is that, elections have become the centerpiece of how one obtains power. Ever since we had the third wave of democracy, many Africans embracing multipartyism and elections being the avenue through which you win power. The high stakes surrounding elections meant that they have to be won, and won at all costs. So as OSISA, we realize that one has to find a way of continuing to push against all the forces that work at making elections not free and not fair. And one of the most important and one of the most militating factor is the capture of electoral systems and processes. We are not just working on electoral capture, but we have two other projects that run alongside this, and hopefully in the coming months, we will be releasing further reports around capture and under the rubric of state capture. We recognize that our countries, not just in Africa, but well beyond, our countries are captured. Our countries are captured by elites. So while the notion of citizen power and citizens being at the center of controlling their lives is a noble and rather sometimes people will argue idealistic notion, the reality is that it is a few elites that have captured all political power, all economic power, all judicial power in many of our countries. So our other two projects relate to the capture of the judiciary and the capture of the economy. We know now that all these things go together, right? If you just look at a country like Zimbabwe, you will know that there is a handful of people who control literally the politics, the economy, and the judiciary. And these elites work together. They are not isolated. And these elites also have external allies who are heavily invested in them continuing and remaining in power. And some of these external allies are whole countries. So the geopolitical aspect of capture, of political capture or state capture goes beyond just a few individual businessmen controlling politicians or ensuring that those politicians are elected so that they give them tenders and contracts and they pass laws that are favorable to them and they give them stakes in state companies and so on. It goes beyond. It goes outside the country. You have whole countries that are heavily invested in certain individuals remaining as presidents in certain countries because those individuals have invested heavily in those countries for themselves. So they will not countenance an alternation of power in those countries. We've seen this in many places. We've seen the role of China, for example. We've now seen the growing role of Russia and the related role related to mineral extraction in our countries. How do you expect a country, for example, like China, to want an alternation of power if it has invested billions of dollars in a country and it has mining concessions for 50 years? It's not going to accept it unless, of course, it thinks it can negotiate with whoever wins power, but it's easier to just let the person in power remain in power. So the capture is done well in advance. We are seeing that the entrenchment of business elites in politics is part of the game, and it has simply the effect of demoralizing citizens. It has the effect of disempowering them, disenfranchising them. It makes elections really meaningless because as much as citizens do whatever they want to do, the results are usually predetermined by this small elite who are really sucking the state as well in return for investing in it. I see I have 1 minute left, and I'll just use this minute to thank my brothers and sisters at Civio and IDEA and everybody who's worked on this project. I look forward to learning a lot from these reports. They will be giving us nuggets, I'm sure. And I want to thank you once again for joining this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sipho, for your opening remarks. And I think, like as you've shared, that this has been an ongoing study, and we're right close towards reaching the finishing line of, publicly disseminating the findings. But today's event really is just to give a sense, of what the study has unearthed and uncovered. And I think to also gain insights from those of you who are in this space, who also have experience in this space, before the researchers just finish finalizing their studies, and we prepare them for publication and wider dissemination. So moving on from those remarks, we're going to move on now to Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, who, as I've mentioned, has been the lead researcher around this area and led a team of 3 researchers who were introduced later on in undertaking this study. So as I said, it's a 3-country study, and we looked at Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Zambia. But just a quick introduction of Prof. Olukoshi, though I don't think he needs one, but he's currently based at the Wits School of Governance and has extensive years of experience in this area and in the areas around international relations, governance, human rights, both in the academic sector and in intergovernmental institutions. Prior to his appointment at Wits, he was the director for Africa and West Asia at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. He brings with him a wealth of experience in the subject matter and area from across the continent and across the world, I think. So I'm going to hand over now to Prof. Olukoshi, who's just going to give us insights around the concept and context of electoral capture in Africa. So over to you now, Prof.
Thank you very much indeed, Eda, and good morning to all of the colleagues and participants who are on this conversation this morning. And I'm really very delighted to be here, both in my capacity as the lead researcher of this project, but also to enjoy the company of diverse and illustrious group of colleagues who have joined us in the conversation today. I see a lot of familiar faces, but let me first and foremost, in case I do run out of time, introducing the subject, thank most sincerely Tendai Murisa and the team at CVO for all of the support in carrying out this project over the last few months. But also thank Sipo Malunga and the team at OSISA, not least amongst them Ichumile, as well for the confidence which you reposed in us as a team to help carry out this component of a broader set of studies, which OSISA has been nurturing around the notion of capture, both as a concept, but also in terms of its ramifications in the Southern Africa region. And that theme, that concept of capture was one which, as a team, we grappled with from the outset. We recognize that in the context of much of the debates going on in Southern Africa, particularly today, the notion of state capture has entered into the vocabulary of all actors as a source of concern. So much so that, as you know, in South Africa, a Zondo Commission was set up to look into the various dimensions of capture that played themselves out, particularly during the Zuma years. And we see that the politics, even of that commission, is still unfolding, suggesting, of course, that the whole idea of capture at whatever level speaks also to the question of the management of power, the uses to which it is put, those who benefit from those uses, and what consequences capture might have for the greater political economy of any given country. And so one of the things which I think we tried to sort out as a team was to clarify in our minds and for operational purposes what capture could mean in the context of an electoral system and process. And here I think I should just put on the table for discussion the idea which we came up with, that states around the world, not just in Africa, states around the world exist under what one might call a state of capture. So that capture in and of itself may not intrinsically be the issue in contention here. What could be in contention, what seems to be in contention, is the very kind of capture that we have seen playing itself out in many places around the world, including in Africa, whereby, as Sipo described, a new complex of power emerges that does not seek accommodation with other interests and centers of power, and therefore in that process produces a new monopoly of power that excludes by definition and which monopolizes in terms of its practice. So states generally exist in a state of capture, but particular kinds of capture become contestable and problematic even earlier than they run their course, precisely because of their monopolizing and exclusionary nature. And when this is refracted into the arena of elections, we begin to deal with a dynamic in which, again, as noted by Tendai and Sipo, we find a political machinery that is put in place that predetermines the outcome of elections even before the first vote is cast. A predetermination of elections, which of course speaks to the integrity of the electoral system and process, and fairness and equity in the voting process is hardly the concern of this power complex in seeking to reinforce its grip on a political economy. But over and above that, I think we can understand capture in the electoral arena as going beyond simply the integrity of the electoral process. Because again, as noted by Sipo, the very process of electoral capture predates the actual casting of votes by citizens. Indeed, by election day, the outcome of the electoral process may already have been predetermined in a way that basically reduces the exercise to a formality, a pro forma cynical exercise even, in which there is no doubt, insofar at least as presidential authority and power are concerned about what the outcome is likely to be. Now, this was, of course, not always a process which existed at the onset of Africa's entry into the so-called third wave of global democratization in the 1990s. Because at the dawn of that process, quite a lot of hope was in the air across the entire continent. In Southern Africa, it was the end of apartheid, the release of Nelson Mandela, the organization of multi-party elections in which all citizens participated, and which fed into a dynamic that was taking place elsewhere on the continent. For example, the National Conference movement that enveloped much of Francophone and parts of Lusophone Africa, signaling the end of single party and military rule and ushering in a new era of electoral pluralism. And those hopes were not unfounded. You remember that Mbeki actually captured the mood of the continent when he spoke about the African Renaissance. And that push for a Renaissance was underpinned by efforts to reorganize the basis for Pan-Africanism on the continent with the transition from the OAU to the AU and the adoption of a set of norms and standards which were meant to cement the transition to a more democratic form of government, at least in any case, elected civilian authority as the basis for the exercise of power. And here the adoption of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, ACDEC, which basically pushed the agenda of rejection of unconstitutional changes of government, became one of the big wins of that transition from the OAU to the AU, alongside others such as the doctrine of non-indifference, to be contrasted with the doctrine of non-interference, on the basis of which the OAU functioned. And we saw moves in many countries, a lot of them underwritten by citizens and activists, civic activists, basically attempting to ensure that the electoral system was operated on not only a multi-party basis, but on the basis of integrity, the integrity of the vote and of the electoral process. And hence, in almost every context of transition, massive resources were invested, not only in citizen education and the rules governing the formation of political parties, but also the composition and functioning of election management bodies, many of which actually came to carry the name independent. And in terms of the early results, we saw an alternation of power taking place in some of the places where life presidencies have been imposed. In the context of Southern Africa, I think a very good example is Malawi. But elsewhere on the continent, we see an alternation of power between ruling and opposition parties coming to settle down almost as a part of the political culture in those countries. Ghana, Benin Republic, at least until recently, Senegal, and a whole host of others became good examples of an alternation of power on the basis of a predictable electoral cycle governed by a term limitation that seemed to suggest that we are moving in a completely new direction. And yet, we also began to see that as time wore on, and as the political elite failed in most of our countries to make a good connection between governance and development, between elections and the dividends of democracy. The political terrain also became muddier as time went on in a good number of countries, leading to a situation in which a zero-sum approach to politics became the order of the day, manifesting itself ultimately in the gradual abandonment of term limitation, but also adherence to the basic principles and values of electoral fair play that we saw in the first decade or so of the transition from authoritarianism to electoral pluralism, and ultimately creating an atmosphere in which regimes in power, incumbents in power, basically invest themselves in a prime objective of reproducing that power no matter what, within a zero-sum context, which also is marked by a severe fragmentation of the political terrain in such a way that creates a disarray of the opposition in the ranks of the opposition almost on a permanent basis, whilst ensuring the coherence and cohesion of a power complex, of a power oligarchy that basically predetermines who gets what, when, and where. And that has constituted the essence of the politics of electoral capture on the continent, including in Southern Africa, which for a very long period of time prided itself as being not just a peaceful and stable sub-region of the continent, but one which was also forward-looking, living, as it were, on the what one might call the Mandela aura and the promise of the so-called Rainbow Nation. And as that era faded and as the promise itself eroded, manifested in a deeper gulf between state and society in Southern Africa, what one might say, as enacted elsewhere on the continent, as we see in various countries, as a fraying of the social compact between state and society, we also see a gradual deterioration in the political record of the Southern Africa region, producing a situation in which unyielding post-liberation regimes basically stick to a multi-party political dispensation as a formality for gaining legitimation internationally, but not as a reality for the promotion of fair play and integrity in the political system. And that logic, that idea that they cannot give up power, that they cannot lose power, has basically been at the heart of the organization of politics in most of the countries of Southern Africa. And here particularly, I pay attention to the liberation movement countries. Now, whilst we might argue that electoral capture has come to settle in many countries of the continent, including in Southern Africa, becoming a part of the fabric of the organization of power in most of the countries of the continent and of the sub-region. It's also important for us, I think, politically, and maybe the example of Zambia's recent elections points in that direction, for us to understand that capture is not a fatalistic condition. At least capture of the kind which we have seen and which is under contestation is not a fatalistic condition, but rather one which in itself is open to countervailing forces and processes. And here in particular, I think one of the most important sites of countervailing power remains the politically conscious citizenry that is able, precisely as we saw in Zambia, to play the role of the vigilant watchdog that seeks to counter all of the steps and measures that are taken all through an electoral cycle by an incumbent power elite to thwart the will of the people and predetermine an outcome. And the sites of citizen contestation are multifaceted, it seems to me, including the election management bodies, but also the internal dynamics of political parties, and finally, the role of the citizen as an observer and an active observer in the political process, able not only to defend the integrity of the vote against all odds, but also to ensure that the political elite is aware that ultimately the highest office in the land still remains the office of the citizen. And in the case studies which we undertake of Zambia, of Zimbabwe, and of Mozambique, we see in two cases the patterns by which over a period of time, a political elite operating within the framework of a power complex has sought to consolidate capture over a period of time. But we also see, in the case of Zambia, the ways in which organized citizen power and response to efforts at capture can be thwarted and reversed through the power of the people. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would pass the floor back to the microphone back to our program director. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that illuminating oversight around the concept and context of electoral capture in Africa. So I'm going to quickly hand over to the first of our three researchers, Dr. James Mzondijka, who's going to be looking at the notion of electoral capture in Zimbabwe. Dr. Mzondijka is a historian and who has strong research interests in African governance, politics, and economics. He holds a PhD in historical studies from the University of Cape Town and has over 30 years of working experience in the academic, research, and development sectors, including teaching at the University of Zimbabwe. He also worked for the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa and was more recently with PAD Zimbabwe as a knowledge management advisor. He's now working as an independent research consultant, and he came on board in this project to undertake the study for Zimbabwe. So Dr. Mzondijka, I'm going to give you 15 minutes to just provide, oversight and I think key or salient points just around the notion of electoral capture, but looking at it from a Zimbabwean context.
Thank you, Ada. I'm trying to unmute my video so that people can just put the face to the voice, and then if you can kindly mute me again because my internet is not so stable, so I don't want to be lost through the presentation. Right. So thanks again to Tendai, Sipo, and Prof. Adebayo for the elaborate introductions. I think Prof. Adebayo is already a lot of things which he has outlined in his conceptual presentation. Those of you who are familiar with Zimbabwe can actually relate to a lot of that information. I think what I simply want to emphasize from the onset is that if you look at some of the literature on electoral capture in Zimbabwe, it tends to conflate electoral capture and electoral manipulation, which basically includes the usual processes, which I think Prof. Adebayo was also alluding to, that of where the dominant forces in society and politics always try to find ways of influencing the outcome of elections. And I think this is something which we find not just in Zimbabwe, not just in Africa, but I agree that it's something which we find the world across, including cases of fraud. I think the recent election, the last election in America, where the incumbent president alleged fraud, that's part of the usual stuff of electoral manipulation, which you encounter in electoral democracies. But I think when it comes to electoral capture, we are basically looking at a situation where the principles, the fundamental principles of competitive and fair elections are systematically subverted to reproduce a predetermined result. So if you look at Zimbabwe from 1980, for instance, you will find that a lot of the things which we see, or the factors which we see as shaping the dynamics of electoral capture today, are actually something which started way back in 1980. The use of deployment of violence, for instance, in enforcing particular communities to vote in a particular way, something which, if you look at observer reports for 1980 elections, 1985 elections, 1990 elections, you get this as a recurring theme. The issue of gerrymandering of constituencies, this is something again which you find when you look at the electoral patterns from 1980. But I think, as Professor Adebayo correctly pointed out, what we need to pay attention to is the differences in the degrees in which electoral manipulation, the whole practice of elections is actually undermined. And I think in the specific case of Zimbabwe, there is a juncture in the history of the country where you can say, look, we have had electoral malpractices, but from this particular juncture, and I would like to suggest that from 2000 onwards, that's the juncture when we can really talk about electoral capture in Zimbabwe's electoral politics. And I think when you then look at that historical moment of the post-2000 period, it also becomes important to try and understand why and how electoral capture begins to manifest itself in Zimbabwe's electoral politics. So this brings me to the second part of what the chapter tries to this project tries to do, which is trying to outline the key dynamics of electoral capture in Zimbabwe. And I won't dwell much on this because I know that most of Zimbabwe is one of the most discussed countries in the region and in the continent, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. But I will just highlight some of the few dynamics of that electoral capture in Zimbabwe's politics. The first one is the capture of the complete control of the electoral management body, which is the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. If you look at the history of elections in the country, you find that while the incumbent government had tried to exert some form of influence in the electoral management body, it was not until post-2000 period that it really descended on the on ZEC to ensure that it has absolute control over the running of affairs through the deployment of party loyalists and through the deployment of what government loyalists. And if you look at 2000, I think it was in 2004, for instance, where you had the government deploying the current Supreme Court judge, Justice Chiweshe, who is also an ex-military guy, to go and head the delimitation commission. The delimitation commission, which was quite critical in reshaping the boundaries of the 2005 elections. And after he had completed his assignment at the delimitation commission, you then find that he was later deployed to chair ZEC from January 2005. You also had, after that, you also had the late General Douglas Nyikayaramba, also deployed to become the chief executive officer at ZEC in the post-2000 period. And currently, you will know that the chief executive officer at ZEC, Sly Gwana, is somebody who has also served in the military. So you can see a pattern where where the government is actually trying to make sure that the election management body is completely controlled, and to make sure that whatever goes on it doesn't really, there are no mistakes to be made there. And we know that some of the complaints of the opposition, civil society, has actually been around the increased deployment of state security agents, your CIO, your serving, and even both serving and retired members of the military to that body. Another practice, I think, which we have seen in the case of electoral capture in Zimbabwe is also the deployment of the military in the coordination of the elections themselves, from the collation of the results to the counting. If you look at our post-2000 elections, the military has played a very critical role there in terms of even relaying the results from the ward centers to the constituent centers, to the provincial centers, the national command center, and that in itself is not just through accident; it's through deliberate design. The third issue, which I think has been quite critical in state capture, in electoral capture in Zimbabwe, is the deployment of violence to influence voting behavior. I have already pointed out that violence is not something which you begin to find in the running of elections in post-2000 period. It's something which has been ongoing, but the extent to which violence was used has been used in the post-2000 period. I think it's massive compared to the pre-2000 period. The 2008 election being a classic case where I think statistics talk about between 200 and 300 people who were killed, and also a massive displacement of voters from their constituencies, and resulting in them not being able to vote. In the past, you had cases of violence in specific parts of the country. For example, in the 1985 election, there was a lot of violence in Matabeleland, and which was already under Kukraundi violence. But this was more like targeted violence, but not on a national scale that we begin to see in the post-2000 period. But I think when you also talk about deployment of violence, it's also important to distinguish between the forms and kinds of violence which have actually been used. You find that there is what scholars like Zizek have talked about as a subjective violence, which is very easy to tell, because you can see both the agents and the targets. But then there is also objective violence, or what others have also described as a crafty violence, where it's very subtle violence, it's systemic violence, which might not necessarily involve physical force, but it's that kind of violence which forces voters to vote in a particular order. For example, if you look at most of the voters in Region 4, Region 5, which are drought-prone parts of the country, which basically rely on food from the Social Welfare Department or International Development Partners, the denial of that food becomes a very subtle, not subtle, a very objective way in which voters are influenced to vote. You also find, I think within this crafty violence, you also find that over the last decades of economic decline, what you then have, what we have had as part of this electoral capture is the increased use of patronage politics and patronage economies to ensure that voters vote in a particular way. The whole issue of mining rights, the whole issue of trading sites for informal sector traders. These are all forms of intimidation, forms of coercion, which have been used to ensure that voters vote in a particular way. Sometimes we are not able to quantify it, but if you look at it, I think in terms of even when we begin to talk about the trajectory of electoral capture in Zimbabwe, this is something which people really need to start paying attention. I think we have been used to very crude forms of violence, and we haven't paid attention to that kind of crafty intimidation, crafty manipulation, which actually which influence voters in a very particular way, especially in societies where citizens are economically deprived, and they rely on elites, and they rely on the state for their livelihoods. I want to quickly, I know that I'm running out of time. I want to quickly go to trying to just do a quick dissection of what are the underlying factors on or institutions which are influencing or promoting election capture in Zimbabwe. I think it is only through our understanding of these underlying factors that we are able to deal with the challenge of electoral capture. The first one we have to understand is the structural foundational factors, which include the liberation war cultures of violence, which I think my brother Sipho and Tendai, brothers Sipho and Tendai talked about in their introductions. This obviously continues to influence our attitudes towards democracy, our attitudes towards elections, and those cultures, until we deal with those cultures, we are going to continue getting challenges around our elections. Then the other issue, which I think previous speakers also alluded to, if you look at Zimbabwe, the nature of our politics in the last 2 decades, Zimbabwe has been going through highly polarized politics, characterized by hatred politics, basically. Not just hatred, not just internal polarization, but also interference by external actors. Sipho talked about interference. Obviously, the heavy investment by countries like China, Russia, etc., in the mining sector, which makes it very difficult for them to allow situations where any winner can come through. We also know that across the political divide, there's also been the whole interference of Western nations in Zimbabwe's domestic politics with support countries like the United States of America, countries like Britain, supporting morally and politically and materially opposition parties, and that in itself also has created some form of election capture, in the sense that it has actually sort of allowed the incumbent state to dig deep and present itself as a state which is under attack from external opponents, and therefore is justified to keep on holding on to power at all costs. So that's an issue which we need to reflect on as we proceed. Then the other issue, I think, which is quite problematic, is the issue of our electoral political system. The presidential system, the first past the post system, which makes it very difficult for any political party which is not which is in power to imagine a political future without the control of state power. So I think this is something, again, which we might want to discuss on how we make sure that we reduce the political stakes in the elections, and then you don't have situations where political parties get into an election determined to hold on to power. And I think the example of the violence which we saw in the presidential rerun speaks to the problems with the first past the post system. Lastly, I think the other issue which we will have to deal with when we deal with the subject of economic capture in Zimbabwe is the economic vulnerability and the increased economic dependence of citizens on the state. That obviously, without giving agents, without finding ways of giving citizens agents, it is always going to be difficult to deal with that electoral capture. I would like to thank you. Back to you, Eda.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nzondishka, for those insights. We're now going to move on to our next country of study, which was Mozambique. And the research on electoral capture in Mozambique was undertaken by Professor Adriano Nvunga. So Professor Nvunga is a scholar and a leading civil society activist in Mozambique. He's currently the executive director of the CDD, which is a democracy, governance, and human rights organization. He also teaches political science and governance at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the Eduardo Mondlane University in Maputo. Professor Nvunga, I'm going to hand over to you now to just take us through, your insights and key oversights around electoral capture, but looking at it from Mozambique.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity of being here and sharing our conclusions on Mozambique's electoral capture. Our central argument is that there are 5 factors that dictate electoral capture by Frelimo, and Frelimo is the former liberation movement in Mozambique, which is ruling since independence in 1975. And these factors are the following. The first one is the proportional representation system. The second one is the deficient electoral management system. The third is the weak electoral observation. The fourth, the partisanship of the police and the opposition's lack of technical capacity. I will then touch on the democratic implications of this electoral capture that points to high voter abstention, government weak political legitimacy, and the post-electoral military conflicts and violence. I will divide this presentation in 3 key moments. The first one is the foundations. The second one is the first juncture towards capture, and the third juncture, which turned Mozambique into what could conceptually be labeled as non-competitive democracy. First, Mozambique experienced 2 wars. One is the liberation struggle, which led to Mozambique's state in 1975, and there Frelimo emerged as the monopolistic organization that controlled the instruments and ushered the Republic of Mozambique. Because of the political freedoms related to the Soviet approach, we had a civil war. And this civil war in Mozambique was to some extent structured alongside the divides and the legacy of the liberation struggle, in the sense that the republic that we have inaugurated in 1975 from the independence reflected the structuring of the liberation struggle, where a northern military elite and the southern elites have constituted the backbone of the Mozambique Republic, to some extent excluding the central region of the country, the Sotemaza, Sofala, Tete, Manica, Zambezia region. So this has been the divide that shaped the civil war that started 2 years after independence, and it was only ended in 1992 through a peace deal brokered by Italy. In that 1992 democratic transition, so the ending of the war and democratic transition, we can see the foundations that led for Mozambique's captured electoral process, because it was not a process aimed at democratizing the country and society, but for the former liberation movement, it was a binary process between Frelimo and Renamo. And the two political movements had a militaristic origins and procedures, although they have changed the military uniforms, but their ethos and their modus of operations, operandus, they are highly militaristic. And in 1992, it was about ending the war on the one hand, and on the other hand, starting a dispute to control the state machinery. So in 1992, although Renamo went to Rome relatively strong militarily, but Frelimo cleverly emerged from 1992 peace deal as the founder of the nation, as in fact, they recovered the political motive of ruling without including anybody. So, and there were mistakes. One is that it was allowed for, unlike in the South African case, in Mozambique, it was allowed for a 2-year transition without a transition government. So Frelimo had the opportunity to shape the emerging institutions of the state to reflect the fact that Frelimo was the government, it was the part of government, and it had the opportunity and the resources to structure and put its own people. This is where the institutions emerged. In that democracy founding election in 1994, that election, it was managed by the United Nations Operation for Mozambique, UNUMOS. That was the unique election where the results were not contested by the opposition. And in that election, if the first past the post system was used, the former rebel movement would have parliamentary majority. But because the system is a proportional, it allowed Frelimo to win parliamentary elections and the presidential election. And winning that election, it gave Frelimo the opportunity to set in motion everything for what it has resulted in what I term as non-competitive democracy. Frelimo then used the governance to put in place all instruments to turn the police into a partisan police that serves the interest of the ruling regime. And However, in the next 5 years, the former rebel movement was still very strong, to the point that, in fact, in 1999 election, which was the second election of the country, not only if the first past the post system was used, Renamo would have won parliament majority, but also, and importantly, only electoral fraud stopped the candidate from the opposition, Afonso Magashu Lagama, the Renamo leader, from becoming the president of the country. Electoral fraud stopped that. And that set the juncture. Frelimo realized that the former rebel movement, it was such a powerful political party, and then used governance to thwart the capacity of the Renamo's capacity. So one would say that in the first 2 elections, Mozambique had a competitive 2-party system, and was only stopped in 1999 by electoral fraud. So fraud has enabled Frelimo to retain the power and then use governance to set in motion a process of electoral capture. As of then, Mozambique's electoral legislation, it has been changing from election to election. And those changes are aimed at responding to emerging threats to Frelimo securing power. All electoral changes are not aimed at strengthening the democratic systems of governance, but instead to thwart an emerging threats to Frelimo. So what I mean here is that on the one hand, the electoral institutions, they are partisan. They reflect the composition of parliament. So since Frelimo has majority in parliament, it controls the institutions of electoral governance. And the opposition, having minority position in parliament, they also have minority representation in the electoral governance institutions. There have been a number of changes, including bringing civil society. But the process of selecting civil society to be part of that process is fraudulent, it is corrupt, and Frelimo uses its own civil society to elect the representatives of the electoral governance institutions. So that is one of the key arenas that enabled Frelimo to capture Mozambique's electoral process. And in reality, what happened then is that a controlled electoral machinery, it is used to negate the vote, the franchise, to many constituencies, starting from fraudulent electoral registration, fraudulent electoral process in all subsequent elections, to the point of in the most recent election in 2019, to have the sense that that election was not competitive. And it can only barely be labeled as an election because it has excluded significant part of electorate on the one hand, and on the other hand, results were changed most of the time with the use of the police, which is partisan. So the police, for instance, in several districts, they could pick the boxes, run away with them, replace the ballot by other, which are filled by prelim groups, and then they're returned. So in reality, it is a non election. So I've talked about the proportional representation, and to unpack it further, the extent to which it contributes to electoral capturing is that in reality, although it is proportional, but in reality, it is the winner takes it everything, takes it all. Why? Because in Mozambique's highly centralized system, everything is dependent on the president. The parliament, the members of parliament, they are toothless people. They are toothless representatives. They are there to parliament to rubber stamp on the one hand, on the other hand, to gain their own salary and stipend and so on and so forth, and a diplomatic passport. The proportional representation in parliament does not reflect in resources for the opposition, does not reflect in the capacity of the opposition to influence governance and to influence policies. No, because everything, it is dependent on one man, and that man is the president. To such a small things, it is dominated, controlled by presidency. So parliament is an institution. It gives diplomatic passports to members of parliament. It gives them good salaries and prestige, etc. But it has no influence. So not only it negates the opposition from participating in governance and influence, and therefore exerting some capacity, but importantly, if you remember what I've said, that the Frelimo, its capacity, it is a southern plus the northern, and the central, they are more into the opposition. So since the Mozambique's proportional system, it does not result in resources for the opposition. That means that the opposition has nothing to give to its supporters. People vote, they voted in 1994, they voted 1999, expecting that the party they support, they will finally make it and then result in governance benefits. But that did not happen. So then people prefer to stay away from voting because their vote, it does not reflect or result in something tangible or meaningful. So Mozambique's electoral capture, it is also shaped by the stay away behavior of voters, to the point that Mozambique has about 15 million people with electoral capacity, but only 4 million they turn to vote. And you know, when there is high abstention, it favors the incumbent because they're able to mobilize their supporters, those who benefit from the system, to turn up and vote. And the police is what I have already. It is not. It doesn't behave as a Republican police, but it is rather a partisan. Just to give you an example, 3 months ago, we went to Supreme Audit Institution to deposit a petition. They nearly shot me. The police were there to stop civil society from depositing a piece of paper, which is a petition against illegal toll gates. Just to have an idea of how partisan the police is. And this has resulted indeed in the opposition not having any ways of institutionalization. if you look at all features of institutionalized political parties, you can draw lessons as to how this has affected negatively the possibility of the opposition parties to gain substantial levels of institutionalizations, including technical capacity. So these are the key factors that have shaped Mozambique's capture. And as I've said, in terms of political implications, is what you see. The system of governance is so small. It is there because it controls the electoral machinery, and it controls the police. So it is not about a legitimate electoral democracy, which is generating a government every 5 years, but rather it is a small elite-centric group that it respects what is set in the constitution, that every 5 years there must be election, but in such a way that elections do not offer any more a venue for a possibility of political alternation. And the implications, what you see, voter turnout, illegitimate government. Look at what's happening in northern Mozambique. To some extent, it speaks to that. It speaks to illegitimate government and governance, and all conflicts. Only 2 weeks, they have killed the junta militar leader, and you would have expected that there would be waves of support in society to the killing of that junta militar leader, but quite the opposite, because not support the attacks to private properties, the killing of innocent people. They understand that the system that is ruling the country is not legitimate. It rests in non-legitimate instruments of governance, including the instrumentalization of violence. This is the story of Mozambique's captured electoral system. I would stop here and be available for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mpunga, for those insights. So we're going to hear now from the last of our 3 researchers, Tunji Namayako. So Tunji is a democratic governance, conflict and fragility expert with over a decade of experience across sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa region. He's worked and consulted for various international and regional organizations such as the UN, African Development Bank, GIZ, COMESA, and COMESA. And his recent work has largely been focused on South Sudan, the Sahel region, Southern Africa, and providing technical assistance to the African Union through the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance on conflict prevention and democratic governance. He's currently undertaking a doctoral research at the University of Leicester, focusing on Africa early warning intelligence systems. So Tunji is going to share his insights and thoughts around electoral capture, but looking specifically at Zambia. So Tunji, over to you. Got 15 minutes. If you can do it in less time, that would be fabulous, so that I can see some comments and questions coming in, but still would like to also afford you enough time to provide your insights.
Okay, thank you, Program Director. Thank you, Professor Adebayo, and all colleagues who've spoken before me. So, Program Director, allow me to just mute my video because my internet is not okay.
Sure, no problem.
Yes, so my research has focused on electoral capture, looking at the context of Zambia. You know, electoral capture in the context of Zambia really is in two broad categories or stages, so to say. There is the period before 1991, which was a multi-party system, where the political process was managed and mobilized to ensure that, you know, power was deposited constantly in the hands of a single political party and a few individuals. This was the first stage, and then we saw the country transitioning to the second stage, which is post-1991, where we witnessed, you know, multi-party democracy, and saw the emergence of, you know, a number of political competitors and stakeholders, you know, on the political stage. And this also led to the emergence of a new form of political capture, where, you know, in this instance now, the capture involved really trying to lock, you know, political opponents who exist on the political stage out of the whole process. So broadly speaking, so suffice to say that Zambia has had quite a very impressive, you know, credentials in terms of, you know, should I say, has had a lot of, you know, good credentials in terms of the electoral process and all that. But its positioning in this regard has been greatly undermined, especially in the last 10 years. And there have been a number of, you know, key driving factors that have led to electoral capture. For the purpose of this research, I categorize these driving factors into three main broad categories. They are political factors, they are legal and police factors, and then they are economic factors. I'll start by looking at the political factors, you know, that have led to electoral capture. The first one is really the militarization of the electoral process. You know, Zambia has witnessed, you know, an increase, you know, in the militarization of political party cadres. These political party cadres are mostly youths, you know, who have been marshaled into some form of militias and have, you know, constantly meted violence against political opponents, thereby shrinking, you know, the democratic or political space for opponents. This has really been increasingly deployed, especially by the former ruling party, the Patriotic Front, where they effectively used this tactic to lock out, you know, political opponents from mobilizing citizens to vote. So this is one aspect of the militarization of the electoral process. The second aspect has been the use of police and military to really constrain the electoral space. You know, we have witnessed in Zambia, you know, the use of the police to implement, you know, some draconian legal instrument called the Public Order Act, used to completely, you know, lock out political opponents, especially the opposition, from mobilizing people, you know, and this has really also been effectively used by especially the ruling party to ensure that only they enjoyed the political space to mobilize people to vote. In the same vein, you know, there were also elements of the military, you know, increasingly playing a role to influence the outcome of elections, especially in favor of the ruling party. One good example that I would want to cite here would be in 2015, during the presidential by-election and the 26th general election, you know, the country witnessed, you know, incidences where, you know, the top brass, like the service chiefs, would appear on national television 1 or 2 days, you know, before the elections, you know, to more or less like give statements that were a bit threatening and declaring, you know, loyalty to the government of the day and all that. So the military, in a way, has really also played a role in terms of, you know, creating perceptions and conditions that favored the ruling party. So this has been one aspect of it. There's also been the abuse of the media, which has been mostly slanted, especially the public media, to only, you know, cover certain political narratives during the electioneering period, completely locking out, especially the opposition, from being heard. So this has really also been one big tool that has been used, to capture elections. Suffice to say that Zambia has had a very vibrant civil society movement over the years. But in the last 10 years, you see a much more fragmented, civil society movement in the country. And this has weakened its capacity to provide the proper checks and balances in having, a credible electoral process. And there's also been quite very little investment, financial investment by the cooperating partners in the CSO movement to support this process, especially in the recent years. So these are some of the factors that have really, political factors that have contributed to electoral capture in the Zambian context. Very quickly, moving to the legal factors. You realize that with the conflict trajectory in Zambia, electoral conflict trajectory in Zambia being on the rise and increasingly being used or deployed to influence electoral outcome, it is a pity that Zambia completely lacks, a robust, credible, coherent national peace architecture. Nothing of this sort exists. There is a framework that exists within the Electoral Management Board, ECZ, the Conflict Management Committee, which are largely ad hoc and very passive. But overall, the country has got no national peace architecture to have a system-wide coordination, coherence, and consistency in terms of managing, the entire landscape to ensure that, elections are managed in a way that is peaceful, transparent, and credible. Hence, this provides room, for violence to thrive, or for violence to be deployed to influence electoral outcomes. So secondly, on legal aspect is the aspect of the separation of powers. We have seen consistently where, especially the judiciary, the executive especially, has exerted a lot of pressure and influence on the judiciary and sometimes the legislature to ensure that its interests are taken care of. An example of this would be 2016 again, when there was an election petition on the outcome of the electoral process, where opponents perceived it to be, a captured election, so to say, and you get, threats. You witness situations where the executive or the president then at the time issues threats to the Concord that, anything, short of, declaring him, the legitimate winner would spell chaos. And the same happened when, the former president was, vying for the contentious third term, in Zambia. Similar threats were issued to the judiciary in that regard. So that is one aspect, the issue of the lack of clear separation of power between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive has really played a big part in the electoral capture. There is also the aspect of the ECZ itself, the Electoral Commission of Zambia. Its management infrastructure really provides for conditions where it lacks independence and leads to election capture. You have a situation where the chair and the commissioner are appointed and sworn in by the president. Technically, they owe their allegiance to the president. And then you've got also a system where elections, the gatekeepers to the electoral, process and outcomes in Zambia are called district electoral officers and provincial electoral officers, who are spread across the country and really take care of this process. However, ECZ doesn't have, staff of its own. They use members of staff who are government officials, mostly from the Ministry of Local Government, as district electoral officers and provincial electoral officers. These are people who are wearing two hats during the elections time. They can, in most cases, their role to really, ensure that there's a credible process, free and fair, is always compromised because they are always fearful of their jobs as their government employees, because their role within the commission is ad hoc and is always during elections time. So this lack of separation between, government employees or a government infrastructure and ECZ infrastructure in terms of managing the entire electoral process, leads to elections, electoral capture. The last aspect is the issue of economic factors. The issue of growing Chinese debt in Zambia and corruption. There's been great appetite by the previous regime to get, to accrue, loans and debt from Chinese, because there are very little, accountability mechanisms attached to this debt. So this really increased the influence of the Chinese in the Zambian, setup, political and economical. And we saw an increase or alleged increase by the Chinese funding, especially the ruling party. As a result, it was always some kind of like a matter of life and death to ensure that all systems were captured, to ensure that the ruling party retained the power to take care of Chinese interests. On the economic factors, there's also the issue of the business partners of the ruling elite. There are, a plethora of reports about, very close business partners of the ruling elite who always or constantly play a very big role to ensure that in terms of funding, mostly they are even the people who finance these, the youth militias that I talked about and so on and so forth, money deployed to buy votes and things like that. So that is the other side. There is also the issue of the economic decline in the country, which leaves most of the people very vulnerable. The youths have no opportunities for upward mobility, hence they easily get recruited into these militias, which are used to constrain the political space for other competitors. And it also increases, political party patronage and so on. So going forward, really in Zambia, I think to do this, there's need for security sector reforms, electoral reforms. There's also need for, a very robust national peace architecture, in my view, because this is one area that has been very problematic and has consolidated, all aspects of electoral capture in Zambia. And also one key dimension that has really emerged, especially in the last election, is the issue of ICT, which has played a very big role, in my view, to undo, or to kind of like slow down the process of electoral capture. Now with the social media and all the new media and everything technology, it was interesting how people were really able to communicate and be able to collect results from across the country within a very short period of time. And this really is one key positive aspect from the elections. So for now, Program Director, I leave it here and leave time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tunji, for those insights that you've shared on electoral capture from looking specifically at Zambia. I think across the 3 case studies, there were quite a number of useful insights that were shared and similarities, that also, I think, touched upon and drew on what Prof. Olukoshi shared when he provided an insight in the context around electoral capture across the African continent. So I've taken note of, there's a couple of comments and questions that have come through on the chat. And I'm just going to go into the questions quickly. There's about 3 that have come, 2 in fact, sorry, that have come across so far. But we can still then open up for any other round of questions after that. So Vengai Mukwena asking any of the panelists, and anyone is welcome to provide a response, is asking what are the differences between electoral capture and democracy capture? So I don't know if maybe that one I can throw to you, Prof. Olukoshi.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I think maybe since we've spoken a lot, we could probably gather a group of questions, and then so we give participants a chance to comment if it's agreeable with you.
Sure, I think that will work as well. So let me do that. I've also noted that Neo and Tendai have their hands up. So let me read the second question that was in the chat, and then I can ask Neo and then Tendai to unmute and ask their questions or provide any comments. So the second question that was there was from Judith Kaulem, and Judith's question was, what capacity has the emergence of social media had as a tool for influencing this trajectory of electoral capture? So that's a second question. And then I can take Neil. Neil, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. May I thank the team, in particular Silvio and Osisa, for supporting this initiative. I think it gives us more detailed and focused discussion around elections, because I think there's been so much study of elections, but I think we have not really got a handle on what takes place and why, we continue to talk about the same things. That elections are manipulated, there's fraud, and this is something we know, but for some reason we have continued to repeat the same mistakes. So I congratulate the team. I'm happy to see a buy-off after a long period. Congratulations for this excellent study. I just wanted to add one or two explanations on the Zambian case. I think the Zambian case is fascinating, but I think it's also important that we look at the other explanations. I think one in the Zambian case is interesting in that it's important, I think, for the team in their own studies to also consider the intra-party fragmentation. When within the ruling coalition, when there is fragmentation, there is also a possibility of change. In the case of Zambia, there was a division within the ruling Patriotic Front. And this division was on account of Edgar Lungu wanting to stand for a third term. It was on account of the unfair distribution of patronage, but also it was on account of exclusionary politics. So those factors internally affected the coalition, but also the collusion by other factors. Adriano talked about a partisan police and partisan military. We have a similar experience in Zambia. But what happens is that you have a partisan police that is divided on the fact that those who are associated with the opposition are victimized. So it's not necessarily coherent. So that lack of cohesion within the military establishment then allows factions of this group to actually support the opposition. And this is what happens in the case. And lastly, I think the other point that Tunji could take into account in the discussion on Zambia is the role of the youth. Yes, the youth were divided, the youth were used and mobilized into militias, but this youth was actually fragmented. Most of it would not benefit from the empowerment program. Most of it was not part of the militia. So when this youth turns up in large numbers, as was the case in Zambia, it can actually bring about change. So again, the role of mobilizing, the mobilizing of the youth to have a high turnout affects outcomes, because there is a limit to how the manipulation can be done. So the more this is done, of course, becomes a problem. It becomes difficult for them to manipulate. But of course, lastly, I think the investment which was put in protecting the vote in the Zambian case also is important. But of course, it answers the question of the fact that people have knowledge of how manipulation takes place. Because we had the experience of 2016, and with that knowledge, it was possible to avoid what really happened in 2016 by ensuring that there was high turnout, despite the fact that registration was actually low, but also to ensure that it was difficult to manipulate the vote because people knew exactly how it would be done. So I think that is also can be factored in the explanation that elections are manipulated, but then the knowledge that this is how it's done, the fact that there are these divisions, this lack of cohesion in the establishment itself can actually work to the advantage. But I think the knowledge about the fact that the meter, Zimbabwe, for example, is a good example of the fact that the military and security establishment benefits from the electoral system. But in the Zambian case, some of these groups were not benefiting much from the system, so they were able to fall out. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Neo, for those insights. So we'll move on to Tendai, and then I've also noted questions from Philan Zamchia and Zikamai Bere.
Yeah, I see my brothers Pilani and Zikamai, so I'll try to be short so that they can come in. I'm interested in hearing what they have to say. But I think in this discussion, and I'm so grateful to the presenters that they've just not looked at elections as an event, but rather as a process. But perhaps also a question that we have not really asked is, are we tracking sufficiently who's funding elections, whose interests are served by those who are funding elections? Because I think elections across Africa have become a big money game. It's really big monies that are invested in elections. And I think those interests will begin to tell us about the extent of capture by external interests also that are served by local proxies. But I think for Zimbabwe, and this is very important for us, that historical approach that James was giving us, I think maybe if you had just started just prior to independence, where Arigi sort of cites two contestations for power between what he called agrarian capital and mining capital. Mining capital being the one that sort of drives for the settlement, the Lancaster House settlement, represented mostly by Tiny Rowland and also by the, what is the other mining company, the Anglo-Americans, etc. But at that moment, representing a certain interest to say, we are not doing well in business given the restrictive measures or the sanctions that were against Rhodesia at the moment, and seeing settlement as a possible way out of the rut. And also, but at that moment, there was a contest with agrarian capital, which was benefiting from the subsidies it was getting from the state, and also the fact that its market was localized. So what we see at independence, mining capital sort of wins at the end of the day. It gets the settlement and continues with sort of its accumulation trajectory is not affected. Mining laws are favorable, etc., until we get to the indigenization period in Zimbabwe, where Mugabe is undoing all the mining privileges, is insisting on local ownership, etc. And you begin to see against behind the scenes sort of actions, etc., leading to the coup itself. The military assisted sort of transition. But in it, if we just see it as a coup that sort of serves an interest, factionalism within ZANU, is we're not analyzing what the different factions represented. The faction that is ruling in Zimbabwe, the victorious faction, the Lacoste faction, is more associated with mining capital, given the military's interests in diamonds, and also its investments and partnerships with China and Russia. So that's the dominant. So, but that the linkage with international mining from actually outside of the West, but more linked to the East. So that's the domination that we have right now. And when you begin to unpack the capture now, you begin to say, so who are the new Tiny Rowlands? Who are the new Anglo-American CEOs? Who are these? So we see even black faces now are sort of coming together, putting this together. If you look at Kuvimba Holdings as a site, also not only just of accumulation, but also of determining patterns of power, and also allocating resources for the status quo. So I think that's very important for us to continue building upon and understanding that, to say, if you're looking at elections, you have to be looking at where the resources are coming to support a regime. So if you look at ZANU-PF, for instance, leading to its elections, there's a fleet of cars that is given in 2018, just before the elections, that they use. You have to understand, where were those cars coming from and whose interests were they serving? So I think we're still in that place. For a post-settler country, we're still in the place whereby we still have the contestations around different sites of capital, mining and agrarian capital. But if you look at agrarian capital, what Mugabe had done through fast track, it decimated the large-scale commercial farming sector and also its advocacy or lobbying capital, to an extent that all it could do right now is this sort of coming behind the scenes and clamoring for a global compensation agreement, which, interestingly enough, is actually going to be funded by mining capital, because mining capital's interests are not just in maintaining power here, but are also in cleansing or making sure that Zimbabwe is sort of reintroduced to international financial circuits, sanctions are lifted, and Zimbabwe can trade again. So I think in analyzing issues to do with capture, let's also be analyzing the trends around accumulation, especially the dominant capitalist sectors that sort of determine accumulation in our countries, beyond the political parties that we are seeing, but who are the powers behind the political parties and the factions within those political parties. Thanks, Eda.
Thank you so much for that, Tendai. So maybe we'll, if Philen and Zikamai are happy for me to read their questions that were in the chat, and then maybe we can pause there and allow the panelists to respond. So Philen's question is powerful, and point of clarification from Dr. Mzondishka. Is he suggesting elections in Zimbabwe are partly captured by Western countries? So, and then the question from Zikamai, which I think also is response to Dr. Mzondishka's presentation, is that we have seen in Zimbabwe the role of business in building a war chest for electoral manipulation. And I think it's something that Tendai also just started touching on. So his question was, how do we deal with the role of business in electoral capture? So I'll go back to our speakers. Maybe we can start with Prof. Olukoshi to maybe touch on maybe the first two questions around what is the difference between electoral capture and democracy capture, and then maybe the role and influence of social media in influencing or in influencing electoral capture.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, colleagues, for all of the feedback and comments and questions. I would consider electoral capture to be a subset of democracy capture. I think just in the same way as questions of integrity might point to the onset of a process of capture, but do not sum up capture as such. Capture being broader than simply incidences of electoral fraud. In fact, fraud might actually be the culmination of a process of capture. I would consider electoral capture also in the same vein as a subset of broader democracy capture, insofar as democratic politics encompasses much more than just elections. And there are various aspects of a democratic system, which also, I think, Adriano pointed this out in a very stark manner with regard, for example, to the balance between the executive and the legislature in Mozambique, which is, I think, replicated in many of our countries, in which the legislative role, the role of the legislature and the judiciary in providing checks and balances, at least in terms of what classic liberal democratic theory tells us, is completely undermined. And instead you have a reinstatement of old-style presidentialism, in which the president, as head of state, head of government, is also the key determinant of policy and politics, around whom key processes are concentrated and centralized and delegated as he mostly sees fit within the political system, including also erasing the boundary between a president in office elected on the platform of a party, but also simultaneously, even whilst not holding a party office as such, effectively functioning as the key determinant of what goes on in a political party. In some parts of the continent, this is captured under the broad notion of the president elected from a party as being the leader of the party, even though you have elected officials who run the party, but essentially subordinated to the presidential whim and caprice. So electoral capture for me is a subset of broader democratic capture. And incidentally, a study was recently published by CDD Ghana. Adriano was a contributor to that project on the whole notion of democracy capture. Basically, I think documenting the ways in which the high hopes of the transitions that began in the 1990s gradually got eroded and derailed in a manner as to become almost completely unrecognizable from some of the expectations which we had some 20, 30 years earlier about Africa entering a second so-called phase of liberation. I think also with regard to social media, one of the things which we have noted insofar as this has served as an arena of contestation of capture, we have seen measures being taken across the continent also, in which regimes try to muzzle out social media, and some of it done very crudely. We're already used to the pattern in some countries where on the eve of elections and immediately after, social media is completely turned off, right? You cannot tweet, you cannot, well, unless you find ways to bypass the restrictions. But on the other hand, we also see, I think more worryingly, a mining of social media information by regimes precisely for the purpose of subverting the will of the people, and also narrowing the capacity of people to be effectively able to contest policies and the direction of politics. So people have been arrested and charged to court, sometimes with high crimes of treason, simply because they have exposed the behavior or misbehavior of holders of office. Some have even been locked up for criticizing the president on Twitter or on Facebook and the like. At the third level, just as we've seen with civil society, even in instances where an outright ban hasn't been imposed or the issuance of threatening legislation has not been enacted. And we've seen legislation in many countries trying to control social media without necessarily banning such media outrightly or even restricting them during elections. We've seen situations also where regimes have organized their own social media conversations. And in some parts of the continent where politicians are fairly rich, highly endowed, they actually have an army of social media influencers who are working full-time to try to shape public opinion and counter the voices of civic activists who are using that platform to try to build a political consciousness or sustain a mobilized citizenry. to contest. I think this would be an interesting domain of further study for us to undertake as part of the broader understanding of the dynamics of capture. Program Director, I'd like to close by thanking Neo Simutanyi for his input, the examples which he gave of Zambia. And I think that fits very well into what I refer to as countervailing measures, which are available to citizens, but which also deserve to be compiled and analyzed for us to fully understand the possibilities for going beyond capture, and certainly for not considering that a state of capture is either a permanent condition or a fatalistic one to which we are condemned. Capture can be contested, has been successfully contested in a number of cases, not least by vigilant citizen observers who insist that their vote will count and will not allow the kind of fraud which we have seen perfected by many a ruling party from prevailing, especially in contests where the only option other than violence, violent contestation of governments to bringing about change is precisely the vigilance of citizens to say that their votes will not be manipulated. I note the question on finance, but and also Tendai's suggestion about the need to understand the structure of accumulation, but maybe other colleagues will comment on that. Otherwise, in the closing session, I will also be happy to speak briefly to that. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Prof. Olukoshi. So just a quick one, I do note it's 12:01, so I could just ask our participants to indulge us for just maybe another 15 to 20 minutes to just get through the round of questions and the concluding remarks at the end of this discussion that we're having. So, Dr. Mzondijga, there was just questions in relation to Zimbabwe about one, in your presentation, were you suggesting that elections in Zimbabwe are partly captured by Western countries? And then maybe, you could maybe start to touch on the question which was asked around how to deal with the role of business in electoral capture. There was a comment that we've seen in Zimbabwe the role of business in building a war chest for electoral manipulation. So maybe you can have you can come through to just comment or provide feedback around those two questions.
Okay, thanks, Ada. Let me just quickly respond to the last question around Western governments and the whole notion of election capture. I think my broad response to that is that international capital in general, whether you're talking about international capital from the East or from the West, and international community are not always bystanders in elections, and they are always direct and subtle ways in which states and international capitals seek to influence electoral processes in different parts of the world. Whether that kind of attempts to influence electoral outcomes constitute election capture now again depends on the degree and extent to which that those processes are unfolding. And the same applies to internal capital. I think Tendai raised this quite well. I caught up the tail end of his presentation, where businesses are also not just bystanders, because they are quite interested in the nature of the state, in the players in the who dominate the state, because for business to thrive. And this is not just unique to Zimbabwe, by the way, or Africa, by the way. It's something which you find everywhere. That's why you find then that in most jurisdictions there are demands that the political parties should actually declare what they've received in terms of funding and how much they who has been funding them. It's all, I think, it's part of that acknowledgement that there are different actors and big players involved in when it comes to elections. But so yeah, really, I wouldn't say directly that, and I wasn't suggesting that they are Western countries are a part of the election capture. I think when you look at the Zimbabwe situation, what you do have is a situation where you have an incumbent, a party which has been in control since 1980, and of course has used its networks and influences in order to continue being in power. But it doesn't mean that Western countries are also not implicated in the dynamics we have talked about. I think where what I was trying to suggest is that actually that Western support, whether it is overt or covert support, is what has been used as a pretext for the incumbent government to actually to make sure that they will not lose that power come rain or thunder. And so these are some of the dynamics which you cannot run away from. As long as that question continues to recur, then it is always going to be difficult to deal with the issue of the election capture.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mzondishka, for those insights. And I think as you started to, your response to the question of, how to, the role of business in electoral capture kind of dovetails into a question that Gilbert Chisenga had, that maybe Prof. Mvunga and Tunji, you can also maybe provide insights on that. Can the disclosure of political party financing as well as political parties funding be the panacea to political and electoral capture? Gilbert just goes on to mention that there has been reluctance in Zambia to enact the political party bill to actualize political party funding. What then can non-state actors, civil society do to mitigate or have early warning signs of electoral and democratic capture? So maybe Tunji, Prof. Mvunga, I could ask you to maybe first Tunji and then Prof. Mvunga to come in around that question.
Yes, thanks, Eda. Actually, I see two questions here. The issue on political party funding, disclosure. Yes, I agree. If this political party bill to actualize political party funding, disclosure is signed, it will definitely go a long way to undo some aspects of this electoral capture. I mean, the issue I spoke about Chinese and other, business, groups funding the ruling party then, which was the Patriotic Front. Whilst they could be true, but it's not only the ruling party that gets money from all these business interests. It's common knowledge that even the opposition receives huge sums of money with a lot of conditionalities attached to that. So this bill, yes, is very important in the Zambian context, as this disclosure would really undo some aspects of this kind of capture that comes with economic interests. The question on what can non-state actors do to mitigate early warning signs? I think for me, when I look at the electoral landscape and when I look at the civil society movement in Zambia, there's very little investment in terms of early warning systems, for sure. You see some little aspects of early warning systems during polling time. And these ones, they are more or less like situation room, basically just used to track the ballot, so to say. They do not follow an electoral cycle approach. and they do not take a broader aspect to really monitoring different aspects that, you know, contribute to electoral capture. I have not really seen any robust system from any of the CSO or non-state actors in Zambia at the moment. There was one which was being operationalized by the Human Rights Commission, which is a quasi-government institution. I understand the politics that surrounded it. It was really not very functional because it also suffered from a lot of political influence from the ruling party. So non-state actors or CSOs really need to invest in robust early warning systems, focusing on the entire electoral cycle approach. I think that's what I would say at this point. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Tunji. Then Prof. Mvunga, maybe you can touch on any of the questions that have been asked, and also maybe just share any final thoughts or insights you have around this area. Prof, your microphone is still on mute. Okay.
I'd like to give an example from the Mozambique context, the difference between electoral capture and democracy capture. When it comes to electoral capture, that means the overall electoral governance, which starts from legislation, and then it goes to the electoral institutions, the procedures, and then to the electoral court. All this, it acts as like an orchestra. So they will pass a legislation which it undermines opposition last minute. Then they will exclude candidates from different constituencies at the electoral institution. Then you will make an appeal to the electoral court. They will simply say it is, they will fail it on the basis of procedures. So they will not look at the merit of the case, but only on procedural issues. This has been the trend in Mozambique. So as I've said, you have an electoral capture when the party in power, it organizes election for the sake of democratic presentability to the donors or to outside powers, but it is not a fora where the citizens have the possibility to shape anything. This happening, then you have in the 5 years in between the two elections, you have the manifestations of the democracy capture. An example, you want to, a civil society movement, you want to deposit a petition. They will allow you to do so, but the judiciary will not do anything. They will not act because they are accountable to the president. Mozambique here, it's a typical case of that. We have about 10 petitions deposited with the Supreme Audit Institution to Parliament. There is no answer, and it dies that way. It is that because the overall institutions, they are out there to serve the interest of maintaining the power of the former liberation movement. It is not out there to serve the citizens and to service, to give the possibility of the citizens to enjoy the rights and freedoms in the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution is out there, but there is no constitutionalism that allows citizens to enjoy those freedoms and rights. Having said this, in the case of Mozambique, it would be good to know how much money goes to Frelimo, how much money goes to Renamo. But that, my friends, it wouldn't change much. Why? Because, as I've indicated, what happens today is path dependent. Before political liberalization and democratization, Mozambique has undertaken an economic liberalization and privatization that only meant the following. And the sequencing of the reforms, this is so silly from the World Bank, that the Mozambique structural adjustment, it was used to tick the box, but in reality, it allowed Frelimo from a centrally planned economy to privatize the state assets and give it to its people. So it has created a new constituency. So Mozambique private sector, it is Frelimo. If you look at the statistics and the role of the state, if you look at the business to business, it's less than 2%. Mozambique's economy, it's about the state giving contracts to private sector. And that private sector is dependent on Frelimo continuing in power. So contributions are not necessarily in monetary terms. It is the overall architecture of the private sector, of this state economic sector, to see Frelimo continuing in power. So they can give you the expenses. It's going to be within the margins of the law, but in reality, they enjoy way much more benefits, everything. If you looked at the Frelimo campaign in the last election, my friend, that would be like the Hollywood kind of jet set organization in far rural districts, millions of dollars, not in monetary terms, but in services given to Frelimo to continue, because the structure of the economy, which is extractive, it gives power to Frelimo to give out contracts and those, of course. Let me give you a criminal example by the biggest, one of the biggest oil companies, Total. 10 days before the election, they farmed in, they bought from Anadarko, the American company, which controlled at the time the assets in the Rovuma Basin. They sold it to Total. It's an election time. This was a $4 billion business, out of which Frelimo cashed $1 billion to its coffers. This money was given to Frelimo, to the president. At the end of the election, no accountability. This is one. Two, the American Exxon Mobil, they also control shares in the Rovuma Basin. They organized a fake final investment decision. They called it pre-investment decision. There is no such a thing. They organized a massive event here in Maputo to give a platform to President Nyusi and his comrades to present themselves as the new people bringing prosperity from the oil and gas industry. So you are right, my brother. The Western businesses, they shape politics and policies, and they define elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof, for those insights. So I'm going to quickly hand over back to Professor Adebayo Olukoshi. I think, you know, we've just not had enough time. There's just so many thoughts and insights, you know, that probably require another round of discussion, maybe when the publication is out, we can look towards maybe having another discussion around this. But I'm just going to hand over now quickly to Prof. Olukoshi to just round up today for us, and maybe share just insights around going forward, what is going to happen, but just really to just give an overview of today's discussions, and just any final thoughts before we conclude today's meeting.
Thank you very much indeed, Eda. Thank you, colleagues and all the participants. This has really been a most rewarding conversation. I would like first and foremost to thank the colleagues with whom we worked on this project, James, Adriano, and Tunji, for all of the work that was put in. The ultimate goal, of course, is for us to bring out a book under the CBO label, and work is far advanced on that publication, which will be made widely available thanks to the support from OSISA. And as many of the participants as are interested in seeing the book either in hard copy or electronic format, are welcome to indicate, as opposed to you, Eda, or to colleagues at the CBO Institute, and arrangements will be made to have a copy sent forward to you. But I think the whole purpose of this project goes beyond simply carrying out an academic exercise, and it has been extremely useful. As Neil Simutai rightly pointed out, that as an exercise, it helped us really to think more deeply about the role and place of elections in our contemporary governance experiences on the African continent, and to answer some hard questions with regards to why the transitions that we experienced in the 1990s have so terribly underperformed their promise and their potentiality. And that's a useful thing in its own right. But more than that, I think is also the interest, which is valid as much for us as individual researchers engaged in our own different ways in quests for improving governance on our continent, as for CBO and OSISA, who by mandate are also central actors in the process of making peaceful change possible, and change of a transformative nature. We are determined that we will carry the results of this exercise, first and foremost, to constituencies beyond this audience who ought to be informed about it and engaged on some of the key findings. And here in particular, I have in mind the Electoral Commissions Forum of Southern African countries, ECF SADC, with whom we hope to be able to convene a policy dialogue that will involve the leadership of the election management bodies in Southern Africa in a session of this kind, where we can pass on key messages from the project. And I think it will find resonance. It already, in fact, has found resonance, because one of the flagship projects of ECF SADC, on which it is working presently, is the idea of how to institutionalize the independence of election management bodies in the region. And it's an ongoing exercise. The commissioners and others themselves have been open to have a conversation around this after some initial reluctance. But at least a conversation has started, and the result of this project will feed in to that conversation and hopefully help to stimulate some action, at least in countries where the balance of forces make it possible for concrete measures to be taken to try to stem the tide of capture. At a second level, we are hoping also that we'll be able to have a dialogue with key political parties, particularly, I think, opposition parties in the SADC region. And here again, conversations of an informal nature are taking place, where, of course, there's an objective interest on the part of many of the opposition parties, insofar as they find themselves basically digging deeper to try to make change happen through the electoral process, but finding themselves effectively wrong-footed and outmaneuvered at every turn. And I think, again, as some of you pointed out, it would be an occasion for us to address issues of fragmentation within parties and amongst the opposition bloc as one of the key messages coming out of this project that facilitates the dynamic of capture in some of the countries. If our resources permit, we'll also be reaching out to the SADC Parliamentary Forum, which has a governance program and does engage in conversations around issues of democratization with members of parliament from the SADC region. So 3 possible policy dialogues emanating out of this project, which we have on our horizon. I believe also that as an enduring contribution, we would hope to scale up the 3-country case study to a study of the entire SADC region, preparatory, hopefully, to launching a barometer on capture. CBO Institute already does a citizen barometer, Pan-African citizen barometer. And we have other bodies that have similar instruments, gender links, for example, with the gender barometer. But we hope also that the barometer on capture will, in a very gentle way, serve as a kind of name and shame instrument, but provide real-time information on the state of electoral politics in as many countries of the SADC region as we are able to generate indicative information on that can enable us to build a robust barometer. But this is something which we'll be having further conversations around CBO and USTA. And in that regard, I join Glenn Barney in his commentary in the notes in suggesting that such a barometer could be, in fact, an important outcome and legacy of this project. But otherwise, it solely remains for me really to once again thank the leadership of CBO Institute, Tendai, Murisa. You are always supportive throughout. And I would not also leave out our program director, Eda, who was our focal point within CBO Institute and within OSISA. Thank you so much again, Sibo, for the confidence you reposed in us to undertake this 3-country case study. And we hope we have, in spite of the delay in completing the project, justified to some extent that confidence. And thank you, Ichumile, for being a good Samaritan, accompanying us all through the process, whilst reminding us of the key obligations with regards to timing and they need to be relevant to both the work of OSISA, but also the broader Southern Africa constituency of actors. And yeah, thank you. And I hope to stay in touch I'll reach out to old friends like Neo, whom I haven't seen in a long time, but great to see you and to see that the fire is still burning in many of us for the betterment of our continent. Back to your program director. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for those closing remarks and insights. I think my job now really is very simple, is just to thank yourself, Prof. Odukoshi, to thank all our other speakers and researchers, Prof. Mvunga, Dr. Nzondichka, Tunji, thank you so much for sharing these insights. May it be the start of many more discussions, sharings, knowledge generation around this important subject matter. I'd like to thank all who've participated for your comments and insights. Please feel free to still comment around this on the respective Twitter handles for Severe Institute, for OSISA. We'll also be sharing a link of the proceedings which will allow you to then also revisit at a later stage the discussions that were held today. Thank you for also indulging us for another 30 minutes of your time. But thank you so much for your participation today. And on that note, just like to say goodbye to everybody and enjoy the rest of your day further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.